Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I asked my friend Lilliam Barrios-Paoli to join me today to talk about the current Charter Commission and the continuing crisis of homelessness. She's a member of the commission, but also a most formidable public servant who's headed 5 city agencies, run large not-for-profit organizations, and was most recently the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services. It's really staggering what you've done. Welcome.
Thank you.
You know, I became a member of the council as a result of the last major charter change, right, which had to dissolve the Board of Estimate because it wasn't one person, one vote, and added, how many, 15 new members? It was 30? Yes. Yeah. Yes. So that was quite a major change. We are assuming that this Charter Commission is going to come up with some major changes. Are we going to be disappointed?
No, I think it will. I think it will. I was appointed by the Speaker, Corey Johnson, and it's the first time that there's a Charter Commission that is made up of all the public elected officials, as opposed to just a mayoral commission.
Which we had on the ballot at the same time. Well, your Charter Commission was never on the ballot. It was created by the council, right?
It was created by the council, and then the mayor joined it, and the public advocate and the board of presidents. So all of the elected officials have representation. It's the first, I think it's a more thorough attempt to really look at what happened in 1989 and try to see if it still makes sense. And so it's been so far a very interesting place to be. We've had a lot of hearings. We had public hearings in every borough. And then we decided jointly to create what the chair, Gail Benjamin, calls 4 buckets. And the buckets are elections, general, governance, finance, and land use.
4 major
areas. Yeah. And so the idea is to look at things within each bucket that makes sense to take a good look and perhaps restructure, perhaps not, but what does it make sense? We've had a lot of expert testimony, which has been really interesting. We've had a lot of experts come in, a lot of ex-government officials. So it's been a really good
former elected people too.
A lot of former elected people, a lot of presently elected people that had a major feeling about what should happen.
So let's start with governance. What does that mean?
After 1989, allegedly the concentration of power went to the mayoralty, in detriment to all of the other elected officials. So the mayor, all of the powers that were invested in the Board of Estimate went to the mayor by and large.
It didn't get divided evenly.
Equally. And so the Board of Presidents lost a lot of power, and so did this position called public advocate.
Which then was president of the city council.
Was then president of the city council and had a lot more power.
Yeah.
And so now we have a speaker of the city council, but the power that the president of the city council had, neither one has. So does it make sense to look at things like advice and consent in some appointments? The corporation counsel, which is allegedly the lawyer for the city of New York, but appointed by the mayor and works for the mayor. And so does he really evenly represent the council, the board of presidents, the public advocate when they need a lawyer?
It's a discussion that we see in Washington, right?
Correct.
With the Attorney General. Okay.
So does that make sense? The police commissioner, it's a really important position. Does it make sense to have advice and consent by the city council?
Department of Investigation.
Certainly the Department of Investigations has been rather controversial in the last couple of years.
Because the mayor fired one.
That's correct. And should they have a set term? Should they be should the mayor not be able to fire them except with consent and advice by the city council? And then some commissionerships like the city planning commission. So there's a number of things that people see as above the fray, if you will, and not per se mayoral agencies because they have everybody's interest at heart. So should they have advice and consent?
And it was said at the time in 1989 that the public advocate was established. There were 2 reasons. Paul O'Dwyer, who had been president, was a big advocate of that job. But also there was an incumbent president of the city council. And you never like to take a job away from an incumbent, right?
That is
so they made it up for him, basically.
True.
But it always has seemed to me it's a redundant position because it's really taking power away for the council members in their district.
I think you can argue that. And I think, it's a very tricky position because the argument has been either you empower it further or you do away with it. Because right now, as it exists now, it really doesn't have any teeth.
But as is said also, it's a citywide election.
It is.
And as we've seen from this last special election, what happened? We had 20 candidates.
Right. And but then people see it as it's a trampoline to the mayoralty. And that's why some people are loath to do away with it. But then, empower it further. I mean, it could be very powerful to have somebody who represents the people and advocates for them. But you have to have some teeth if you're going to do that.
That would come in more with fair share things and things like that are overall.
Right, and they should have a budget that is set as a percentage of something, so that any mayor coming in doesn't feel like they can cut it to ribbons, and that's
which they do. Yeah.
Which they do.
And the other thing is, it's a result, really, isn't it, of the term limits? Because people don't stay in their jobs longer than 2 terms, so they've got to move. So that's why they need the citywide office after the council.
And I think that has weakened the city council also, because once people get to be really experienced, then they have to go. And
but that's not in your charter.
That's not. Term limits are not in the charter.
Why?
So, it was not something that came up. And we did a lot of listening, and there were a lot of other things that were highlighted, but that did not come up. So I guess people do like term limits after all. So it's an interesting piece. I mean, we had over 600 suggestions from the public as to what things should be in and what things should not be in. So that was, that's where the little sub-bucket things came in.
And are we going to have, how many council members are going to leave the council this year?
I think it's usually a third.
A third
term.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's problematic, because it's, it's now that they really understand what their mission is. It's really that they understand how to legislate, how to do the work, and now they're gone. And you lose a lot of experience.
Right. So what's the next bucket?
So the next bucket is finance, and there's a lot of discussion around the lack of transparency in the budget. The city agencies, by and large, and the mayoralty offer very large units of expenditures, and you don't know what goes into it. So if you get, as a council person, you get, a unit of expenditure that is $200 million, and that's it. You don't know where did that go. So that's a legitimate thing. They have the budget should be much more transparent.
And it's a game.
It is.
It's a game. The mayor proposes the budget, and they always leave a certain amount for the council, because they know the council needs some money to make a change. So what is it, like $80 million or $90 million?
Right. So there, there has to be a change in how the budget is conceived.
And the capital budget?
The capital budget as well. Then we're talking about campaign finance and how that works, and that's part of some of the finance things overlap with the election pieces, and the election pieces have to do with everybody was mildly horrified at what happened with the public advocate. Not only the number of candidates, but there was a special election. Somebody got elected. We almost had a runoff. Then they have to run again in June, and they have to run again in November. It's a tremendous expenditure of money for not a particularly satisfying result.
So what do you think is going to come out?
So I think ranking, voting, so that people can do, can rank
so you
their
vote
votes.
First, second, third choice?
Right, so that you don't have to essentially have a runoff if you do that. Some localities have been very successful at it. I believe Seattle has been one of them. So we've had experts come from other localities that have implemented these things. The idea, then there's some really cutting edge things like in campaign finance, so to give an allocation to each citizen, and they can then allocate it to the candidate of their choice.
Oh boy.
Very interesting. So some really interesting stuff. I mean, I don't know that they'll make it or it's feasible, but we're looking at really interesting stuff.
Why is there, this is a terrible thing to say, but when is there a limit as to how much are going to be matching funds? Is it only going to be when there are no private funds?
I imagine so.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think so. We're looking at those kinds of things. It'd be interesting to see where we land on that, because we've had a lot of expert testimony, and there's really no consensus anywhere at this point. We haven't had enough discussion. We then are looking at land use, and that was really there's a lot of opinions around whether ULURP has worked or not worked, and how it works, and there's a lot of concern around gentrification and how neighborhoods are open for rezoning and who has what opinion and who measures the consequences. So that has been a really interesting
And a discussion also about whether there should be a master plan every 10 years.
Absolutely, and there are pros and cons. There were some prior commissioners of HPD that were very vocal about no master plan, and then there were some other commissioners of HPD
That's interesting.
that thought that a master plan made sense.
Some people think that they won't be current with what happens by the time they finish the master plan.
That's the thinking, except that you can. But then there's the idea. I mean, there was a Rishi Torres, one of the council people, was very vocal about the fact that we're restructuring the whole waterfront in Brooklyn. And it's been done so piecemeal that by the time you got to the last one, there was not a cohesive plan for the entire waterfront. So there are things that should have a master plan. And we should be looking at that kind of development in the city. And you could do it with periodic, re-looking at it and seeing what happens. But it was a really interesting thing because on face value, I mean, I would be I would like a master plan, but I do understand that it can become so stale that after a while nobody looks at it.
Why was the master plan from when was it, 1969?
Yes.
Why was that never affirmed?
I really don't know.
I don't either.
I don't know, but I think
there was a lot of good work that went into that.
Yes, and I think if you really, I mean, the city should have at least a map of where we're going.
Yeah.
I mean, it shouldn't be willy-nilly developed.
Especially when we have these arguments about where we're going to put different public services.
Absolutely.
Like the fair share of stuff. Any suggestions about that?
There have been a lot of the people that testified, I think the biggest thing was that they feel that the City Planning Commission and the City Planning Department work well, and you don't want to start tinkering with something that isn't broken and then make it worse. But, there's a lot of, the sense was that, I don't know if exactly duplication, but there are too many hands touching everything, the boards of standards and appeal, the city planning, so on. But I think at the end of the day, what we want to do is to strengthen whatever the process is. And we're really fortunate that Gail Benjamin is one of the biggest experts in land use.
She was the head of the staff of the City Council when Europe first came about.
So she has tremendous history and depth on this particular subject. So that's very good and encouraging. And we have Carl Weisbrod, who used to be the head of city planning, and so there's a lot of people who really understand and know this part very well.
This is especially the tension, isn't it, between developers and residents in the community.
Yes.
And the mayor.
Yes.
With plans.
And I think you've seen things that you create great density by allowing a lot of housing built, and then you don't put services there. So you don't have enough seats in the public school. You don't have enough groceries. You don't have enough of anything, and so you create a problem for the neighborhood.
Right.
The subway isn't.
And then the siting of facilities.
Absolutely.
Which is the whole NIMBY kind of argument.
Absolutely.
Well, are you going to address that?
So I think we will. I think we're going to deal with it. I mean, it's very hard because it's if you're talking about homeless shelters that nobody wants in their background, or prisons. I mean, we're going now.
We have to empty Rikers, right?
Correct. And so where do we put them? And the reaction of neighborhoods is no. You're going to devalue my property, and you're going to create a social problem for me. So how do you do it in a fair way? But also, what real estate is available? I mean, sometimes you don't have the space to, you ideally would want to have one in every neighborhood, but there are neighborhoods that don't have any space to put it in. It's all saturated. So it's not an easy situation, but it should be looked at.
It's also interesting. We skipped over the borough president's office.
Yes. Well, in New York, people identify very, very strongly. Maybe not so much in Manhattan, but people from Brooklyn are from Brooklyn, not from New York, and the Bronx and the Queens, and and Staten Island certainly. And so the idea is you need to have somebody who represents the borough and the interests of the borough, but who has real power to do so. Not just the leader in the parade, but somebody who really can make a difference, and either through land use in the borough, through siting in the borough, through allocation of capital budget. There's a lot of ways.
Really, and there's really a good part to decentralizing into the borough presidents.
Absolutely, and even education. The siting of the schools. I mean, it's very interesting. Part of why New York can be so unwieldy is that the numbers are so large. So if you decentralize to the borough, it becomes a lot more manageable.
That's very interesting.
It's sort of a county idea.
When you talk about the boroughs, people in boroughs, though, don't understand people who live in Manhattan. That's what I've always found out in my, you come from Manhattan, so we pay the higher, I think, our property taxes, the parking meters, now with congested pricing. It's all, you're crazy to live in Manhattan with all those buildings and no trees. So I don't know how you ever adjust that.
It is true, I think, but we also have the greatest access to cultural sites. We have the greater access to a lot of other things. And Manhattan is a very exciting place. I mean, that's why some of us do choose to live here in spite of everything.
Right.
It's not very user-friendly.
You're not discussing congested pricing?
No, that was not within our purview.
And environmental things?
Not a lot of it. Insofar land use intersects with it.
And also the question of land use and finance, right? Isn't that a connection?
Yes,
too?
yes. I mean, I think everything intersects with everything else. I think just for, I think some sort of neatness, we decided to have the 4 buckets, but clearly they overlap. One overlaps the other. No question about it.
Right. So you've been on a lot of boards.
I've been on a lot of boards, and this is my second run on the charter revision.
Right. And you're impressed with this board?
I am impressed with this board.
Yeah.
I think it's there's a lot of really thoughtful people. There's a lot of people who really are not being partisan, are not, they really want the best for the city. And there's a lot of thoughtfulness in the process. Just the fact that we've been listening to first to a lot of people, then to the experts, but we're going to go back and have more hearings. So
that's good. Yeah.
We're going back for more
Come back
hearings.
with your final report.
Yes,
Yeah.
and then so there'll be
before the final, but
yes.
proposed.
Yes, and there'll be a lot of discussion.
And we didn't talk about diversity. There's a whole thing about diversity.
Yes,
Explain that.
There was a proposal coming from the comptroller about having a diversity officer in each agency and in the city as a whole. And I think that the concern is that, we all talk about diversity and value it and think how good it is, and then you look at certain agencies and it's not diverse at all. And so, making it a real priority, and I think it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, you look at some of the statistics and it's really frightening how some agencies just absolutely don't have any diversity.
Is that within the civil service also?
Well, part of it is civil service, part of it is, you have to start working. I think some agencies have made a great, a tremendous stride. I mean, you look at the police department 20 years ago and the police department today, and it's a whole completely different police department. You have lots of women, lots of people of color, not perfect, but a lot better.
Fire department?
Fire's begun to move, but that's a much slower process.
Struggle.
But part of it is that it's a very difficult service, but it's been very difficult for women to make a stride or minorities, and I think they've done
going on for years. Yeah.
Still.
Totally.
But sanitation is not. And these are really good paying jobs, and so you do want people to have access to them. The social services has always been well integrated, clearly, but other agencies need to do that. And I think it's important to make a statement that says, this is a priority and we have somebody who's really looking at it.
So let's go back. Now let's talk about when you were Deputy Mayor of Health and Human Services. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Homelessness. And that's always been you ran a not-for-profit that ran facilities.
Yes.
It's always been an interest of yours.
Yes.
Is there any connection in the charter about homelessness?
Well, only insofar as the siting of shelters, if we could do anything to make it
Is
easier.
that under fair share? Is that what you call it?
Yes, yes. So, fair share is a very tricky thing because again, you have to figure out where is the real estate to put these things? Where do you have the space? Does it make sense? It can be near a school. It can be near, so it's very tricky. But yes, I think we should look at it. The more I've thought about homelessness, the more you realize, look, I used to say not one mayor created the problem and not one mayor can probably solve it. But I'm convinced that we're not going to make ourselves out of homelessness by just building. We're not going to build ourselves out of the problem. It takes longer and it's just not going to happen.
And it's not just the mayor.
No.
It goes right up to the federal government.
Totally.
Right.
And they've divested themselves completely from affordable housing. Not only just because of the public housing, but in any other way. I mean, they stopped issuing Section 8 vouchers, which is,
There are no more Section 8 vouchers?
You keep recycling the ones you have, but that's all you have. Very, very, very few trickle down. So it's a real problem. And, look, for there's different kinds of homeless people, right? Families, which is the bulk of the homeless numbers. Families is just lack of housing. I mean, yes, you have dysfunctional families and you have substance abuse and you have mental illness, but you have plenty of people who have all of those things and are housed and much more
jobs.
stable. And jobs.
And
So-
salaries, I mean, what people make, incomes.
So there. So the only way you can make people housed stably is by either increasing their income or subsidizing their housing. I mean, it's not like that difficult to understand,
Right.
difficult to implement. But
Right.
so you either do, a guaranteed income, like many countries have, or you do a permanent, a program of local Section 8 that gives out, subsidizes the housing for people that make less than, you give me the number, makes than 30,000, less than 25,000, but that creates a city-based Section 8.
But the Section 8 isn't always the answer either, because the houses they can find are dilapidated and horrible, right?
Right. So, but if we gave them the guarantee,
Yeah,
and, sort of
right.
mix and match, I think there's much more of a possibility. And you have to have stringent
You have to have
codes.
enforcement. and-
Yes.
Right.
Yes. I mean, there was that
Oversight.
unfortunate report by, I think it was CBS, that showed that people were given 1 year of rental, and they went to Jersey and
Right,
Pennsylvania,
yeah.
right? And they went into dilapidated, horrible housing, and nobody was looking at it, and so on. That's unacceptable. On the other hand, you can have better patrolling, better policing. You can make sure people have a place to go and say, my housing is dilapidated.
Yeah.
What do I do? So you can implement it better.
Right.
But at the end of the day, for families, it's a matter of higher income or subsidized housing, by and large. For people who are singles, we, well-meaningly, we did away with SROs, we did away with the Ys, we did away with cheaper housing alternatives that people making the minimum wage that didn't have a family could access.
And they were not all terrible.
No. Remember the Martha Washington, the Salvation Army had housing. There was some the Ys.
In 1970, when I was the task force chair for the village, we had the most infamous shelters. They were built originally as a shelter, one of them.
Right.
And then it just became unruly because it was people coming out of prison, mental health. At the same time that they were leasing people from facilities.
You have
But now it's a condominium, a market rate expensive condominium, which has happened all over the village and I'm sure all over the city.
And the thing is that for single people coming out of prisons and jails, which is almost 50% of the single, the singles that are homeless, you have to reinvent the SRO. You have to reinvent cheaper housing alternatives. And essentially, that's, I think, at the end of the day. And then the people who are street homeless, who are basically a mental health, substance abuse issue, you have to sort of think.
What happened to those group homes after we emptied out Willowbrook and stuff? Weren't there supposed to be
Yes.
smaller facilities?
Community. We never carried
The
it
state
through.
didn't do it, and
No, and the fact is that that's how they ended up in the street, and there wasn't enough of it. The city has tried different kinds of shelter for the street homeless. I think the most successful ones are the ones that don't put any restrictions, don't say to the person you have to be sober, you have to be here at 9 o'clock, and you have to, but says to them, come in, and then we'll work with you, and we'll figure it out. And they've been, relatively successful with that. But you have to keep building them.
Right. Rooming houses used to be, they used to serve food too, and they were really not bad. But now my grandson is living in an equivalent because it's high rent, but somebody has an apartment, they decorate it, they furnish it, and then these kids come in and pay quite a lot of money for a room in a communal thing, right?
Absolutely, and you have 4 people sharing an apartment, which
Right.
is not legal in the city of New York, but nonetheless, people do it.
Yeah.
Because I had a niece that came to study in New York for a semester, and there were 3 girls rented an apartment, $1,000 apiece, and they could afford a $3,000 apartment. But they had 2 bedrooms, they shared a bathroom, and it wasn't luxury, but it was what they could do. And you have a lot of young people doing that. But what do you do if you're no longer a young person? There's some experimentation around seniors that have bigger places, renting, to somebody.
Right, that's been around for a long time.
Yeah,
It was
but
a
you have-
foundation that did that, right?
Yes, and they're trying to enhance it
Linda,
and make it
yeah.
bigger. But you have to make sure you check people out because you
Right.
don't want to encourage elder abuse or other bad situations.
So, taken all together, do you think the city is really governable?
I think the city is, but it takes a lot of work. And I think you need a mayor with a vision. You need a mayor who really is not thinking about the next job and who really has a passion for the city. And there's nothing wrong with getting a next job eventually, but at the time that they're governing the city, it's a 24/7.
And you need also very strong you need the infrastructure, which is really the other elected officials. And I don't think all of them are ever.
It takes a lot of people to govern the city, and
Yeah.
you know, power sharing is not a bad thing.
Right.
Delegating is not a bad thing.
But we're not developing
No.
leadership.
No, we're not. And I think part of it is that, you know, we don't nurture the next generation. People don't think of succession planning. You know, if you look at, some of us have been recycled probably too many times.
Well, you're an exception. You really are. Because each time you left people who were sorry that you left and other people who were delighted that you came. Anyway, but it could be.
It could be.
But
you know,
here we're faced with a mayoral election, which is going to be sort of like the president of the city council election. We're going to have a lot of candidates, right?
there'll be a lot of candidates, and not all of whom probably
Should be running.
Should be running, but I think that, you know, it's a real conundrum because, you know, you do want young people, you want to encourage people to, you know, feel that they can do it. On the other hand, you know, you don't start by running for mayor. You know, I remember Ed Koch saying to somebody who was running for mayor, you know, there are other jobs you can run for. You know, you can run for the council.
Yeah.
And I think that that's, you know, the city council is a great training ground, but you do need to learn a lot of the things. You know,
So we need to go to schools, and we haven't even talked about what you're doing with Hunter College. So you have to come back, all
I will
right?
do that.
And thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.